They told me my only son was dead, that his body had burned in a wreck just an hour earlier. But how could that be true? When I had felt his damp hand on my shoulder, when I had just heard his weary voice say he was going upstairs to sleep. Imagine being told to grieve while the echo of your child's footsteps still lingers on the stairs. What if the police showed up at your door with death certificates while your heart swore your son was alive? Would you trust their reports or your own memory? Tonight, you'll hear how one quiet mother in a small Vermont town faced that very nightmare, and how the truth unraveled in ways darker than anyone could imagine. Before we begin, tell me, what would you do if your world split in two between what officials claim and what you know in your bones? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if stories like this captivate you, please like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe for more tales that challenge everything you thought you understood. I was stirring a pot of stew in my kitchen, the storm rattling the windows while an old country tune played from the radio. My hands moved by memory, chopping carrots, sprinkling salt, though my eyes kept darting to the door, waiting for Ethan. Then I heard the squeak of boots on the porch. He appeared, soaked from the rain, his coat dripping onto the tiled floor. He barely said a word, just brushed past, his hand heavy and cold on my shoulder. "Mom, I'm exhausted. I'll turn in early. Big meeting tomorrow." His eyes were rimmed red, like he hadn't slept in days. I scolded him gently, told him to change out of that wet jacket. He gave me a faint nod and dragged himself upstairs, his steps slow, tired. For a moment, relief filled me. My boy was home. The stew was just beginning to boil when the doorbell rang, sharp and startling in the roar of the rain. I wiped my hands on my apron and opened the door. 2 officers stood there, rain streaming off their hats. The taller one, with lines carved deep into his face, spoke in a voice too calm, too rehearsed. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. Your son Ethan was in a car crash tonight. He died at 9:15. My fingers froze on the knob. My chest seized. "No," I said, my voice breaking. "That's impossible. He's upstairs, sleeping." The officers exchanged a look, uncertain. Then one asked, "Are you sure?" I almost shouted, "Of course I'm sure. He was just here." My pulse hammered in my ears. They insisted they had to confirm. Trembling, I led them up the narrow staircase. The light from Ethan's bedside lamp spilled under the door. I whispered his name, knocked twice. Silence. I pushed the door open and pointed at the still figure beneath the blankets. "See? He's right there." Relief filled my chest for an instant until the lieutenant raised a hand, drew his weapon, and ordered me to step back. He yanked the covers away. My breath caught. The bed held only a hollow pillow, a jacket, towels shaped crudely into a body. My knees buckled. "I spoke to him," I whispered, clinging to the doorframe. I felt his hand. Who was here if not my son? The rain slowed to a whisper outside, but inside my house, the silence was deafening. I sat on the old couch, clutching a cup of tea that had long gone cold, my fingers numb around the porcelain. Lieutenant Collins paced in front of me, his notebook open, his face unreadable. His partner stood near the doorway, arms crossed, eyes flicking from me to the stairs as if waiting for something to move. I told them again, my voice raw, that Ethan had walked in not even an hour before, that he touched my shoulder, that I heard him climb those steps. Collins didn't argue, but he scribbled something down, then looked at me with a heaviness that sent chills down my spine. He muttered into his radio, requesting an urgent confirmation from the medical examiner. The words barely registered in my fogged mind. All I could think was, where had my son gone? If not upstairs into that empty bed. The hours bled together. I must have sat there staring at the lamp that still glowed in Ethan's room, its light spilling down the staircase like a cruel reminder. I tried calling Claire, my daughter-in-law. Once, twice, 5 times. Each ring ended in silence. I typed a shaky message with trembling fingers, begging her to call me back. The phone stayed mute. The clock crept past midnight. My body shook with a cold that came from inside, not from the storm outside. I whispered Ethan's name into the emptiness, as if he might answer from the shadows. At 2 a.m, the doorbell shattered the quiet. I jumped and rushed to open it. Collins stood there, rainwater dripping from his coat, his expression grim. He wasted no time. The DNA results had come back. The body in the burned vehicle did not match Ethan. My breath caught in my chest, my knees buckled, and I had to grip the doorframe to keep from falling. For a moment, Relief surged like a flood. My son was not dead. But almost immediately, terror followed. If the dead man was not Ethan, then where was my boy? Collins placed a steady hand on my shoulder. His voice was firm yet tinged with compassion. From this moment on, the case would be treated as an official disappearance. They would track every lead, phone records, bank accounts, anyone Ethan had seen in the past days. He urged me to stay calm, though we both knew calm was impossible. I nodded, choking back tears, gripping his business card so tightly it crumpled in my palm. After he left, the house felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing in with shadows. I sat alone, staring up the staircase, praying Ethan would walk down any second, wearing that tired smile of his. But only silence answered. Dawn came cruelly, flooding the kitchen with pale light. I hadn't closed my eyes all night. I brewed coffee out of habit, the bitter steam rising like a ghost. The chair where Ethan usually sat was painfully empty. The cup I set down for him remained untouched. I scrolled through local news on my phone, searching for any mention of the fiery crash the officers had spoken of. Nothing. No headline, no report, as if the accident had never happened. The unease crawled deeper into me. Either the world was keeping secrets, or someone had gone to great lengths to bury the truth. My hands shook as I set the phone down. Somewhere out there, Ethan was alive. But who had taken him from me? And why? By mid-morning, the knock on my door came again. This time sharper, more insistent. I opened it to find Lieutenant Collins standing there with the same grave expression as the night before, his notebook tucked beneath his arm, his partner close behind. He stepped inside without waiting to be invited, rainwater still clinging to his boots, and asked in a low voice when exactly I had last seen my son. I told him again, my words steadier than I felt. Ethan had walked in soaked from the storm. He put his hand on my shoulder. He said he was exhausted and was going to bed. It was just before 9. I was certain of it. Collins nodded, but his eyes betrayed a storm of doubt. He flipped through his notes and finally said the words that made my stomach twist. A vehicle had been rented under Ethan's name at 7 o'clock that evening. It was the same SUV that had gone over the ravine, the same car that burned to the frame. I nearly rose out of my chair in protest. Ethan despised driving, I shouted. His company always provided rides. He would never rent a car on his own. Collins listened, silent, then repeated what the record showed. 7 o'clock, rental confirmed, Ethan's identification used to secure it. I gripped the table to steady myself, my voice trembling with anger and disbelief. That is impossible. He was in a meeting all afternoon and he came home just before 9. How could he be 2 places at once? The lieutenant studied me with a gaze that was neither cruel nor comforting, then said softly that mistakes can happen in memory when fear clouds the mind. My hands slammed down before I realized it, my words spilling out. Do not tell me I imagined my son standing in that kitchen. Do not tell me I dreamed his voice. He was there, Lieutenant, flesh and blood. Collins did not argue. Instead, he closed his notebook and said the investigation would follow the facts wherever they led. He promised to dig deeper. His partner exchanged a look, as if silently questioning whether my grief had blinded me or whether something more sinister was unfolding. After they left, I collapsed into the wooden chair Ethan always used for breakfast, the scent of his coffee still faint in the air from the day before. My hands shook so badly I spilled half the cup I tried to pour. I kept replaying the timeline in my head, every detail. The storm, his wet coat, the sound of his footsteps on the stairs. None of it could be a trick of memory. And yet the evidence on paper screamed otherwise. Someone had used his name, his identification, to rent that car hours before he walked into my kitchen. The question throbbed like a wound. Was Ethan alive and caught in some plot I could not see? Or had someone built an elaborate stage with my son at the center? Unable to sit still, I wandered the house, touching the things he had touched just hours earlier. His shoes still lay by the door, streaked with mud. His jacket dripped from the hook, heavy with rain. No insurance file, no rental record could erase those details. He had been here. He was here. So why had he vanished into nothingness the moment the officers arrived? My chest ached with a pressure I could hardly breathe through. I wanted to scream into the walls, to demand an answer from the silence pressing in on me. When the phone rang, I nearly dropped it. Collins's voice came steady and cool. He wanted to know if Ethan had enemies, if anyone might benefit from his disappearance. He asked if Ethan's wife had said anything unusual in recent weeks. The questions cut into me, and though I answered as best I could, my heart pounded with suspicion that refused to name itself. When he hung up, I stared at the blank wall above the kitchen sink and realized I was shaking. Every piece of the story was unraveling, and with each thread pulled, I felt my grip on reality weaken. That evening, I sat at the table staring at the empty chair across from me, the chair where Ethan had eaten his last meal in this house. My knuckles whitened around the edge of my mug. I whispered into the stillness, more a vow than a prayer. I will not let this vanish into reports and files. I will not let the world write my son out of existence. Somewhere beyond the storm and the lies, Ethan was waiting, and I would not rest until I brought him home. The next morning, Collins called and asked me to meet him at Ethan's office building downtown. My chest tightened as the cab rolled up to the glass towers of Northfield Designs, the company where my son had given nearly 10 years of his life. I stepped through the revolving doors, greeted by the sterile shine of the lobby and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Every corner of this place carried Ethan's presence, yet now his absence pressed down like a weight. The receptionist glanced up and offered a polite smile, then lowered her voice when she realized why I was there. She pointed me toward a conference room on the third floor, where Collins was already waiting. Inside, the air was tense. A young woman sat hunched at the table, fingers twisting nervously around a pen. Her name was Emily, Ethan's secretary. Her eyes were red, as if she hadn't slept, and when they flicked to mine, she quickly looked away. Collins gestured for me to sit. His voice was steady but sharp when he asked her to tell the truth. Emily's lips trembled before any words came out. She said she admired Ethan, that he had always been kind and professional, that she lingered after hours when she shouldn't have, hoping for attention. Her confession spilled out in fragments, each sentence cutting deeper. She admitted she may have caused others to believe something inappropriate was happening. I sat frozen, gripping the edge of my chair as she spoke. I remembered the whispered arguments I'd overheard between Ethan and Claire, his wife, the sudden slammed doors, the nights Claire disappeared without explanation. Emily lowered her head, tears sliding down her cheeks as she insisted Ethan had told her plainly he loved only his wife and would never betray her. She said he asked her to keep distance, to stop fueling rumors. Her voice cracked as she apologized, begging me to understand. I wanted to despise her, but what I felt instead was a cold dread creeping into my bones. Jealousy could twist a marriage into something dangerous. Collins scribbled notes, his eyes narrowing. He asked if Claire knew about the misunderstandings. Emily nodded, whispering about a day Claire had walked in with lunch and found her speaking to Ethan in the hallway. The look Claire gave her, Emily said, was enough to chill her blood. She described Claire's anger, the sharp words, the suspicion that never seemed to fade. I could see it all in my mind. Claire's face tight with rage, Ethan standing weary and defensive, the seeds of mistrust planted deep. Emily wiped her eyes and repeated that nothing ever happened, that Ethan had always been faithful, but doubt once born does not die easily. When she left the room, silence settled heavy. Collins leaned forward, tapping his pen against the notebook. He said jealousy was a motive they could not ignore. My stomach turned at the thought. Claire, the woman Ethan had chosen, the woman I had welcomed into my family, might have believed her husband was unfaithful. I recalled her sharp words at family dinners, her sudden absences, the way she sometimes glared at Ethan with eyes that burned. I sat there trembling, torn between defending her and fearing what she might have done. Collins watched me carefully, as though measuring my reaction. Finally, he stood and said they would continue the investigation, but it was clear the focus was shifting. We walked out of that building together. The autumn air slapped cold against my face as I stepped onto the sidewalk. People hurried past with coffee cups and briefcases, oblivious to the storm tearing my life apart. Collins guided me to a small diner across the street, away from curious ears. We slid into a booth in the corner. The smell of bacon and strong coffee filled the space, but I barely noticed. Collins folded his hands and spoke in a low voice. If Ethan truly had been faithful, then jealousy alone might have driven Claire to reckless choices. He needed me to stay strong, to remember every detail that could help. I stared down at my trembling fingers on the tabletop and whispered that I would not stop until my son was found. As we left the diner, I glanced up at the towering glass building where Ethan had poured out his days and dreams. For a moment, I imagined him walking out the doors with that tired smile, brushing the rain from his hair, coming home with me. But the image dissolved, leaving only the ache of uncertainty. All I knew was that Claire's shadow loomed larger now, and somewhere beyond these walls my son's fate hung by a thread. That night I could not sleep. Claire's face haunted me, her clipped words, her sudden vanishings. My mind wandered back to a comment she once made during an argument, a cruel sentence tossed like a knife. "If you were gone, at least I would have the insurance money." At the time, I brushed it off as spite. Now the words echoed like a warning. Before sunrise, I went to the closet where Ethan kept his important papers. My hands shook as I turned the dial of the small safe. Inside, beneath tax forms and bank statements, lay a thick folder. I opened it slowly, the pages crisp under my fingers. At the top was a life insurance policy, $2 million. The beneficiary was Claire. The paper burned in my hands. I called Collins immediately. His voice sharpened when he heard what I had found. Within an hour, he and a woman named Harris, a financial specialist, arrived at my house. They sat across from me at the kitchen table, studying the documents with cold precision. Harris flipped through the pages, her voice flat. $2 million, payable in case of accidental death. Collins looked at me, his jaw tight. If this was a staged accident, the first person to benefit was Ethan's wife. I felt my insides twist. The woman I had called daughter might have plotted something monstrous. Collins asked me to come along to the insurance company. I agreed without hesitation. I needed to hear with my own ears what she had done. The building rose sleek and mirrored against the gray sky, its polished floors and buzzing lights too clean, too bright. We were led into a narrow office where a manager pulled up records on his computer. His eyes flicked from the screen to us. Yes, Mrs. Claire Foster had been here earlier this week, asking about the payout on her husband's policy. My pulse roared in my ears. She had walked into this place, alive and deliberate, seeking to profit from Ethan's supposed death before the ashes had cooled. Collins asked if she had come alone. The manager frowned, tapped the keys, then turned the monitor so we could see. A security recording filled the screen. There was Claire, her blonde hair tied back, a white blouse, dark glasses hiding her eyes. But she was not alone. Beside her stood a tall man in a gray suit. He rested a hand on her shoulder, guiding her as if they were partners. My breath caught. I knew that face, even blurred by the grainy footage. Mason Carter. The same rival Ethan had spoken of in hushed tones, the man who once tried to take over his contracts, the man Ethan warned me never to trust. I nearly dropped the photograph I carried in my purse, a picture of Ethan smiling. I pressed it against the screen and whispered, "That is not my son." The manager shook his head firmly. "No, ma'am. The man with her was not Ethan Foster." Collins asked for a copy of the image. The printer whirred, spitting out a frozen frame of Claire and Mason together. I held it in my trembling hands, my stomach hollow. Memories surged of Ethan pacing our porch one night, his voice tight as he said Mason would stop at nothing to ruin him. And now here he was, arm around my daughter-in-law, standing where Ethan should have been. Collins' eyes hardened. He muttered that this was no longer just suspicion. This was a conspiracy. I looked at him, unable to form words, the betrayal pressing down until my chest ached. Claire had promised vows before God, had sat at my table, called me mom. Now she was side by side with the very man my son feared. I pressed the photo to my chest and whispered Ethan's name. Somewhere out there he was alive, while the two people closest to him plotted to erase him. The office walls blurred as tears welled in my eyes, but beneath the grief burned a fire. I would not let them win. Collins did not waste time after the insurance office. He drove me straight to the precinct, the windshield wipers beating in steady rhythm against the drizzle. In the back seat, I clutched the grainy photo of Claire and Mason, the edges damp from my hands. The station smelled of stale coffee and ink when we walked in. Collins pulled a thick folder from his desk and laid it before me. Inside were reports, financial statements, and photographs. At the top was Mason Carter, his face hard, his eyes cold, a man who had circled Ethan's business for years like a vulture. Collins explained that Mason had tried to undercut Ethan on 3 major contracts in the past 2 years. Rumors of bribes and threats surrounded him, though nothing had ever stuck in court. He was ruthless, determined to destroy competition. Now his name was linked to Claire. My throat went dry as Collins continued. The tech unit had traced Claire's phone, Her signal appeared hours after the supposed accident, pinging from a small town north of here, Adirondack foothills, a place called Bear Creek. 4 in the morning, long after Ethan's car had been reported burned, I whispered the name to myself, feeling dread coil in my stomach. Collins called in 2 plainclothes officers who had been watching the area. They slid a set of photos across the table. I hesitated before pulling them closer. The first shot made my breath catch. Claire, stepping out of a grocery store in Bear Creek, a bag of produce in one hand, Mason's arm looped through hers. Another photo showed them walking down a quiet street, her head tipped toward him, their faces close in a kiss. My knees weakened. Claire, my daughter-in-law, smiling as if she had never known sorrow, her hands entwined with the man Ethan once called his enemy. I pressed the photos flat with shaking fingers, unable to look away. Collins spoke carefully, but his words cut deep. Witnesses in Bear Creek had described the pair as a married couple. They were seen shopping together, laughing in cafes, moving through town as if they belonged there. The betrayal was not hidden in shadows. It was paraded in daylight. I felt my chest tighten, not only with rage, but with fear. Because if they were living openly together, what had they done with Ethan to make such a life possible? I stared at the photographs until the images blurred, my voice breaking as I whispered, "She called me Mom. She sat at my table. How could she?" Collins opened a laptop, showing me grainy footage taken from a security camera near the ravine where the SUV had burned. The timestamp was hours before the explosion. A lone figure in a dark jacket moved across the screen. The stride was unmistakable. Claire. She glanced over her shoulder, pulling her hood tight, then vanished from the frame. My heart stopped. I pointed at the screen, my words trembling. That jacket. I washed it for her last week. Collins only nodded, his jaw clenched. He did not need to say it aloud. She had been at the scene of the staged crash. The walls of the precinct closed in around me. My son was gone, erased from his own life, while the woman who vowed to love him walked hand in hand with his rival. I pressed my palms together, my voice barely a whisper. If they have him somewhere, if he is still breathing, every minute is a blade against his throat. Collins placed a hand on my shoulder, heavy, steady. He promised surveillance would continue, that no move would be made until they knew exactly where Ethan was. But I could see it in his eyes. Time was running out. When I left the station that night, the streets glistened under the rain. I clutched the folder of photographs to my chest. Each image was a knife, each page a wound. Claire's smile with Mason, the shadow of her figure near the ravine. The world I thought I knew had collapsed. As I walked into my silent house, I stopped at the staircase, staring up toward Ethan's empty room. My vow rose again from the hollow in my chest. Wherever they had taken him, I would not stop. Not until my son was home. And the truth was dragged into the light. Sleep no longer came to me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Claire's smile beside Mason, her shadow at the ravine. My body trembled with a fear that tasted like rage. I lit a candle in the corner of the living room, whispering Ethan's name into the flame, promising I would find him. That was when a memory surfaced like a stone breaking through water. A month earlier, I had overheard Claire on the phone in my kitchen, her voice low but sharp. She mentioned a cabin near the old pine forest, a place she called the Sawmill Shack. I had brushed it off, but now it returned with cruel clarity. The next morning, I went straight to Collins with this fragment. His eyes narrowed as I described the road that curved by a wooden bridge and the tall pines that hid the cabin from sight. He didn't hesitate. He called his team, ordering them to expand surveillance toward that area. While he spoke into the radio, I clutched my hands together, begging silently that Ethan would be there. Collins glanced at me, his voice firm. If this lead was true, it might be our only chance. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. Hours later, Collins returned with urgency carved into his face. A patrol car had spotted a battered pickup with fake plates, the same truck seen near the ravine. Satellite data confirmed it had stopped close to the cabin I described. My chest tightened. I whispered that Ethan had to be there. Collins gave orders quickly, splitting his officers into 2 units. One would remain in Bear Creek to monitor Claire and Mason's house. The other would move on the cabin under cover of darkness. I begged him to take me along. He warned it was dangerous, that what lay ahead could break me. But I could not stay behind. I told him if Ethan was inside, he needed to hear my voice. Collins studied me for a long moment before nodding with reluctant respect. That night, we drove north, the tires crunching gravel as the trees closed in around us. The air smelled of wet pine, the darkness thick as tar. Collins's radio crackled softly, relaying positions of the officers. I pressed Ethan's photograph to my chest, whispering prayers into the hum of the engine. When we turned onto the dirt road, I recognized the crooked wooden bridge from Claire's phone call. Beyond it, half hidden by towering pines, stood the silhouette of the cabin. A faint light flickered behind a cracked window. My breath caught, my pulse hammering in my ears. Collins parked 100 yards away. He and his team moved out silently, rifles slung across their shoulders, shadows dissolving into the trees. He turned to me before closing the door. "Stay in the car, no matter what happens." I wanted to argue, but fear sealed my lips. I gripped the rosary around my neck and nodded. Alone in the back seat, I could barely breathe. I listened to the distant crunch of boots on dead leaves, the faint whisper of radios. Then one of the officers' voices came through, hushed and urgent. They had eyes on someone inside. I strained to hear, my whole body trembling. Through their words, I pieced the scene together. A man, thin and pale, bound at the wrists, lying on the floorboards. My heart seized. "Ethan." Before I could move, Collins's voice came over the line, sharp and steady. "Hold positions. Wait for confirmation." I pressed my hand against the window, staring at the dim glow of the cabin. Tears blurred my sight. My son was alive, only yards away, while I sat trapped in silence. The night pressed heavier, the seconds stretching into eternity. Somewhere in those walls, Claire and Mason were plotting their next move, and my boy's life hung by a thread. The radio hissed with static, then a whisper came through. Movement inside. 2 silhouettes. My grip tightened on the rosary until the beads cut into my palm. From the car, I could see only the faint glow leaking from a cracked window, but in my mind, I was already inside with him. Then Collins's voice came clear. "It's them, Claire and Mason." My chest burned. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, praying for strength. Through the radio, I heard Mason's laugh, sharp and cruel. He shoved my son with his boot, mocking him, saying his mother must be drowning in tears by now. Then Claire's voice, steady, chilling, telling Ethan it would all be over soon, that once the money came, they would be gone living like royalty. I bit my lip until I tasted blood. My boy was lying on that floor, gagged and bound, while the woman who vowed to love him plotted his erasure. Collins gave the order, "Go." The night erupted in a flurry of movement. Officers surged from the trees, their boots pounding against the wet earth. I flung open the car door before I could stop myself, stumbling into the night air, my breath ragged. The cabin door crashed inward, the splintering wood echoing like thunder. Shouts filled the silence. "Police! Drop your weapons!" I froze at the tree line, my heart in my throat. Mason roared in anger, but seconds later, there was the thud of his body hitting the ground. Claire screamed, her voice high and desperate, but it was drowned out by the clink of handcuffs snapping shut. Then came the words I had waited for, muffled through the chaos. "We've got him. He's alive." My knees gave way. I stumbled forward, tears blinding me. I pushed past an officer's outstretched arm, my voice breaking. "Ethan, where is he?" Inside the cabin, the air stank of damp wood and gasoline. My son was slumped against a wall, wrists raw from rope, his face gaunt but his eyes wide and searching. When they met mine, a faint light sparked within them. "Mom," he whispered, his voice hoarse. I fell to my knees, cradling his face in my hands. "You're here. I found you." His arms, weak and trembling, tried to hold me. I pressed my forehead to his, sobbing into his hair. The world around us blurred. Officers moved. Radios crackled. Claire cursed as she was dragged away. But all I felt was the heat of my son's skin, proof that he still breathed. He whispered apologies, broken and quiet, telling me he never meant for me to suffer. I hushed him, rocking him like I had when he was small. "You're safe now. That's all that matters." Collins crouched beside us, his voice steady. "Paramedics are on the way. We'll get him checked out." I nodded, unable to let go of Ethan's hand. The ambulance lights soon painted the trees in flashes of red and white. They lifted him onto a stretcher, his fingers clutching mine until the last possible second. As they carried him out, I followed, my steps unsteady but unyielding. Outside, the night smelled of pine and smoke, the stars hidden behind heavy clouds. Claire's head was bowed as they pushed her into a cruiser, Mason cursing under his breath as his own cuffs bit into his wrists. I looked at them once, and only once. They had tried to take everything from me, but they failed. As the ambulance doors closed, Ethan's gaze met mine through the narrow window. Weak as he was, he managed a small smile. It was enough. I pressed my palm against the glass, whispering to the night, "You're coming home, son. No lie, no betrayal, no darkness can take you from me again." The ambulance carried Ethan away, its siren fading into the night, but I knew our battle was not over. Within hours, Claire and Mason were separated into interrogation rooms, steel tables between them and the truth. I was allowed to watch through the glass, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would shatter the pain. Claire sat hunched, her blonde hair falling over her face, her hands clenched tight. For long minutes she refused to speak, her lips pressed into a thin line. Collins leaned across the table, his voice low but sharp. The DNA test proved the body in the SUV was not Ethan Foster. He asked her who it was. Silence. He pressed harder, laying photographs in front of her, the footage from Bear Creek, the insurance documents signed in her hand. Her shoulders shook. Finally, she lifted her head, her eyes red, her voice cracking. "Fine, I'll confess." Her words spilled out like broken glass. She said she had poisoned Ethan's drink with sleeping pills, that Mason had carried him out under the cover of night, that they locked him in the cabin while she and Mason staged the crash. She admitted they burned the SUV with the body of a vagrant Mason had acquired from a morgue. I covered my mouth, a sob breaking loose to spite myself. The woman who once called me mother spoke of my son's captivity as if it were a business plan. Mason, she said, promised her freedom, money, a new life. Her confession made my stomach twist. Collins sat back, his pen scratching across the page, his expression as hard as stone. Later they brought Mason in. He met every question with silence, his eyes cold, his jaw locked. When Collins laid the photographs before him, Mason smirked, as if even in chains he believed himself untouchable. But the evidence was overwhelming. His laptop had been seized from Bear Creek, filled with files outlining their scheme step by step. A camera taken from the SUV had been found in Claire's bag, its memory card showing her moving the body into the driver's seat before the flames consumed it. Their signatures were on insurance paperwork, ready to claim the payout. Piece by piece, the noose tightened. The trial began weeks later in the county courthouse. I walked beside Ethan, still weak, leaning on a cane, his face pale but his eyes steady. Inside the courtroom, the walls seemed to close in as the prosecutor laid out the case. The jury watched as video of Claire near the ravine flickered across the screen, as photographs of her and Mason in Bear Creek filled the monitors, as recordings from the cabin captured her cold voice promising Ethan's end. I clenched Ethan's hand, my nails digging into his skin, as the evidence was displayed like open wounds. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he rose slowly, the room holding its breath. His voice shook as he told them how he awoke tied to a chair, how he heard Claire whisper that he should just die, how Mason laughed and shoved him to the ground. Every word carved itself into me. The courtroom was silent but for the sound of his broken testimony. Claire wept openly at the table, her face streaked with tears. When asked if she had anything to say, she stood with trembling hands. She claimed jealousy consumed her, that Mason convinced her Ethan had betrayed her. She said she wanted Ethan to suffer as she had suffered. Her sobs filled the room, but no one reached for her. The judge's gavel struck like thunder. Claire Foster sentenced to 15 years, reduced for her confession. Mason Carter, 25 years without parole, for masterminding the scheme and showing no remorse. I exhaled a breath I had carried for weeks. Ethan squeezed my hand, his gaze steady on me. Justice had spoken, but the scars would remain. As we left the courthouse, the autumn air cut sharp and clean, and I whispered a vow to myself. No betrayal, no prison walls would ever steal my son from me again. When the courthouse doors closed behind us, I felt the weight of weeks finally begin to lift. Ethan leaned on his cane, his steps slow but determined, the autumn sunlight washing his pale face in gold. We drove home in silence, neither of us needing words. At the house I made the stew he loved, the same stew I had been cooking the night all of this began. The kitchen filled with the familiar scent of onions and herbs, and for the first time in what felt like years, there was laughter at the table. Ethan smiled faintly as he dipped bread into the broth, whispering that it tasted like childhood. I reached across and held his hand, unwilling to let go. The days that followed were fragile but steady. Ethan spent mornings in the garden, his hands in the soil, pulling weeds, planting small rows of lettuce. Sometimes he paused and looked toward the road as if expecting shadows, but then he would breathe deep and return to his work. I would watch from the porch, coffee warm in my hands, my heart aching with pride and sorrow all at once. One afternoon, Emily, his former secretary, came to the door. She carried a letter of resignation and tears in her eyes. She admitted her foolish actions had fed Claire's jealousy, and she begged forgiveness. Ethan stayed quiet, but I stepped forward, embraced her, and told her that recognizing one's mistakes is the first step to redemption. She left with lighter shoulders, and I knew some wounds were beginning to close. Weeks later, Ethan announced he was ready to return to Northfield Designs. He said the company needed him, that he would rebuild trust, strip away corruption, and make it a place where betrayal could no longer take root. The morning he walked back through those glass doors, employees stood and applauded. I saw in his eyes a new strength born from suffering. That night, he told me he had created a committee of ethics and transparency, a shield against men like Mason. He whispered that he wanted his father's legacy, and mine, to live in the work he rebuilt. Not long after, Collins came to visit. He brought white chrysanthemums, the flowers I had once told him I loved. He set them on the table and sat quietly, sipping coffee, his gaze lingering on the walls that had witnessed so much pain. He said I had been the one who held the investigation together, that a mother's faith can be stronger than any badge. I smiled faintly, thanking him for never doubting me. When he left, the house felt warmer, the silence no longer suffocating but peaceful, as if Ethan's laughter had returned with him. One evening, I pulled out the old journal of my late husband. Its pages smelled of time and memory. I began writing my own story beside his, tracing the nights of fear, the cruel betrayals, the endless waiting, and the moment my son was returned to me. I wrote that jealousy and greed may breed monsters, but a mother's love and the pursuit of justice can cut through any darkness. When I closed the book, I placed it beside my husband's photograph on the mantel, the candlelight flickering softly around it. Ethan came into the room, resting a hand on my shoulder, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Mom," he said, "let me cook tonight. You've carried me through fire. Now let me take care of you." As he moved about the kitchen, the sound of knives on the cutting board mixed with his quiet humming. I sat at the table, watching him, tears rising not from sorrow but from relief. We had walked through the storm and somehow found our way back to the light. Before the meal, I looked into the camera of memory, into the eyes of anyone who might hear our story, and whispered what I had learned. Never ignore the quiet instincts of your heart. Never let betrayal blind you to truth. And never give up on the ones you love, because love, faith, and determination can bring even the lost home again.